Welcome to Whispers of the Blood Moon, where the shadows speak and the darkness whispers your name. If you dare to journey with us into the depths of horror, click like and subscribe now. Let the blood moon guide you and join our circle of the haunted. But beware. Once you enter, there is no escape. The night awaits you. Will you answer its call? Beneath the Canopy. The old SUV rumbled down the narrow dirt road, kicking up dust that hung in the still air. Jared's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes squinting as he peered through the windshield at the thick wall of trees looming ahead. The forest seemed to swallow the road, its canopy dense enough to block out the sun and cast long shadows across the ground. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Kelly asked from the passenger seat, her voice carrying a hint of doubt. She leaned forward, scanning the encroaching woods. "It doesn't look like the pictures online." Jared forced a confident grin. "Yeah, this is it. The campsite is supposed to be a little off the beaten path. Perfect for getting away from everything." Ethan, Kelly's 16-year-old brother, groaned from the back seat. "Yeah, including cell reception," he muttered, glancing at his phone screen. "No bars out here." Ryan, sitting beside him, shrugged. "Who needs a phone when you've got nature?" His tone was cheerful, but even he seemed unnerved by the dense forest. He adjusted his backpack and nudged Maya, who was silently gazing out the window. "You ready for some real camping?" Maya, the oldest of the group and the most experienced camper, gave a half-hearted smile. "Sure, as long as we don't end up as one of those missing hikers stories." The SUV skidded to a stop at a makeshift parking area, a widening of the dirt road bordered by a crooked wooden sign that read, "Nature Reserve." The letters were faded and chipped, barely legible beneath a layer of grime. Jared turned off the engine and the group piled out, stretching their limbs after the long drive. Jared swung his pack over his shoulder and took the lead, pointing toward a narrow dirt trail that wound its way into the trees. "That's the trailhead. Come on, guys. It's supposed to be beautiful if you go deep enough." The trailhead was marked only by a small ring of reddish-brown mushrooms. As they ventured further, the air grew cooler, the sunlight dimmer. The trail narrowed, winding between massive pines and twisted oaks. Kelly's gaze wandered over the tree trunks, where patches of moss clung thickly to the bark. Something about the forest felt off, as though the trees themselves were leaning in, listening. The first unsettling sign appeared after less than an hour of hiking. Deep, jagged claw marks gouged into the bark of a massive oak. Kelly stopped, staring at the marks. "What do you think did that?" she asked, her voice hushed. Jared walked over and glanced at the claw marks. "Probably a bear," he said casually, trying to mask his own unease. "Nothing we need to worry about." Maya frowned, running her fingers over the rough grooves. "It looks too high up for a bear, and the marks are deeper than any bear claw I've ever seen." Ryan shrugged. "Hey, whatever made those is probably long gone. Let's keep moving." They pressed on, the atmosphere growing heavier as the trail led them deeper into the forest. The trees became more densely packed, and the air seemed to grow colder, despite the clear sky above. The occasional rustling in the underbrush made Kelly jumpy, but she kept her concerns to herself. After another hour, they finally reached a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The ground was soft with pine needles, and the dense foliage overhead formed a natural canopy. "This is it," Jared announced, dropping his pack onto the ground with a thud. "Home for the weekend." The group quickly got to work setting up camp. Jared and Ryan pitched the tents while Maya gathered firewood. Kelly wandered to the edge of the clearing, her gaze drifting into the dark spaces between the trees. She thought she saw a flicker of movement, something slipping through the shadows, but when she blinked, it was gone. "Hey, Kelly," Jared called out, pulling her back to the present. "Give us a hand with the firewood, will you?" Kelly forced a smile and turned back toward the group. "Sure thing." As she walked away from the edge of the clearing, she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The fire crackled to life in the center of the clearing, casting a warm glow as dusk settled in. The air had grown colder, and the surrounding forest seemed to press in closer, the darkness beyond the firelight thick and impenetrable. The group settled around the fire, huddling together against the chill. Ethan returned from the edge of the clearing, carrying a few more sticks for the fire. "I thought I saw something out there," he said quietly, tossing the sticks onto the pile. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of unease. Jared rolled his eyes, poking at the fire to coax the flames higher. "It's just your imagination," he said. "We're in the woods, Ethan. There are animals everywhere." Maya glanced up from her spot near the tents. "Even if it's an animal, it's nothing to worry about," she said, trying to sound reassuring. "It's probably just curious." Kelly shivered, though not from the cold. "It feels like everything out there is too quiet," she murmured, her gaze drifting toward the dark tree line. "Like all the usual sounds are missing." Ryan broke the tension with a forced laugh. "Guess we're just used to city noise," he said, though his own eyes kept flicking nervously toward the darkness. As the minutes passed, the quiet deepened. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted, as if the forest itself were absorbing the sound. A sudden rustling from somewhere just beyond the firelight made the group freeze, their heads snapping toward the noise. "What was that?" Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "Probably just a deer," Jared said quickly, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Maya tightened her grip on the stick she was using to poke the fire. "Whatever it was, it's gone now," she said. "Let's not freak ourselves out." They tried to resume their conversations, but the mood had shifted. The laughter and easy banter from earlier were gone, replaced by a strained silence. Every now and then, one of them would glance toward the darkened woods, their nerves fraying with each passing moment. Night had fallen fully, and the fire's glow cast long shadows across the campsite. The darkness beyond the clearing was so absolute that it seemed to swallow the world whole, leaving only the small circle of firelight as a safe haven. Kelly was on edge, her gaze continually drifting toward the blackness just beyond the reach of the flames. Suddenly a scream ripped through the night, echoing from somewhere deep within the forest. It was a high, piercing sound, human but distant. The group shot to their feet, their eyes wide with alarm. "What the hell was that?" Ryan gasped, his voice breaking the stunned silence. Before anyone could answer, a voice followed the scream, faint and distant. "Help me. Please help." Kelly's heart lurched. Did that sound like Ethan?" she whispered, glancing at her brother, who was standing right beside her. Ethan shook his head, his face pale. "I didn't say anything," he whispered. "But that sounded like me." The voice echoed again, closer this time, the words distorted and hollow. "Help me." It was as if the forest itself was whispering, carrying the sound in a way that made it impossible to tell where it was coming from. Jared grabbed a flashlight and shone it toward the direction of the voice. "Stay here," he said, his tone urgent. "It's probably just someone messing with us." Maya shook her head. "We didn't see anyone else out here," she pointed out, her voice edged with fear. The voice came again, more desperate. "Please help." It was unmistakably Ethan's voice, but it didn't sound right. It was hollow, distorted, as if filtered through a crackling radio. "Don't go after it," Jared said, stepping in front of Kelly as she took a step toward the dark woods. "We don't know what that is." "But if someone's in trouble," Kelly began, her voice quivering. "And what if it's not?" Jared shot back, his voice rising with a mix of frustration and fear. "It's trying to lure us out." A faint chorus of whispers began to drift from the forest, overlapping, some too quiet to understand. They came from all directions, wrapping around the group like an unseen fog. Maya's voice trembled as she clutched the flashlight. "We need to stay together," she said. "Something's not right." Jared kept his eyes fixed on the darkness, every muscle tense. "We're not leaving this campsite," he said. "Whatever's out there, it's not going to get us." But as they huddled closer around the fire, the feeling that something was watching them from the shadows refused to fade. The cold morning light trickled through the dense canopy, casting weak shadows over the campsite. The air was still, heavy with the weight of the previous night's fear. Kelly woke with a start, her mind clouded by the memory of the eerie voices that had echoed through the forest. As she sat up and glanced around, a jolt of alarm shot through her. Ethan was missing. "Ethan?" she called, her voice trembling as she scanned the area. His sleeping bag lay unzipped, abandoned. Panic clawed at her as she stumbled to her feet and searched the perimeter of the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest. Jared, Ryan, and Maya stirred, sitting up with groggy confusion. "What's going on?" Jared asked, rubbing his eyes. "It's Ethan," Kelly replied, her voice edged with desperation. He's gone. Maybe he just went to take a leak, Ryan suggested, though the nervous look in his eyes betrayed his own doubts. Kelly shook her head. He wouldn't just wander off, not after last night. They quickly spread out, calling Ethan's name as they combed through the surrounding woods. Kelly's pulse raced as she pushed through the underbrush, her throat tightening with every unanswered shout. There was no sign of him, no response at all. The forest remained as silent and suffocating as ever. Over here. Maya's voice called from farther into the woods. The group hurried toward her and found her standing at the edge of a narrow path, holding Ethan's flashlight. Its beam was weak, flickering as if it had been left on for hours. Jared crouched down to examine the ground. Look, he said, pointing to a patch of disturbed soil. There were drag marks, faint but unmistakable, leading away from the path and deeper into the forest. Kelly's breath caught in her throat. No, she whispered, shaking her head as if denying the reality would change it. We need to find him. With the sickening realization that Ethan might not have left of his own accord, they followed the faint trail into the depths of the woods. The claw marks on the trees grew more frequent and pronounced, as though something had passed through here recently. The deeper they ventured, the darker and colder it seemed to grow, despite the rising sun. The group pushed through a tangled thicket and stumbled into a small clearing. The sight that greeted them made Kelly's blood run cold. Scattered across the ground were bones, some ancient and yellowed, others still with remnants of flesh clinging to them. The clearing reeked of decay, and the pale bones glinted like ghastly markers in the dim morning light. Kelly's gaze fell on a faded blue sneaker lying amidst the remains, instantly recognizable as Ethan's. Her knees gave out as she staggered forward, picking it up with trembling hands. No, she choked out, her voice breaking. He was here. Jared put a hand on her shoulder. We don't know for sure, he said, his voice unsteady. This could have been here for a long time. Maya shook her head slowly, her face pale. This isn't just some animal feeding ground, she murmured, her eyes scanning the clearing. There are human bones here. Ryan took a step back, his face twisted in horror. What? What's been doing this? Before anyone could respond, a deep growl echoed from the far side of the clearing. It was the same chilling sound they'd heard the night before, but closer now, more threatening. They all turned in unison, their eyes widening as a tall, gaunt shape slinked between the trees at the edge of the clearing. Its limbs were elongated, its skin rough and bark-like, and its eyes glowed faintly with a malevolent light. Stay together, Jared shouted, grabbing a rock from the ground. It's trying to pick us off. The creature stepped forward, its crooked limbs stretching toward them as if testing the air. There was something deliberate about its movements, a calculated malice. Kelly's grip tightened on Ethan's sneaker as she took a step back, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It wasn't just an animal, it was something else entirely, something that shouldn't exist. Without warning, the creature lunged at them, moving with unnatural speed. Jared hurled the rock, striking the creature's shoulder with a thud, but it barely seemed to notice. It slashed at Ryan with a clawed arm, narrowly missing as he ducked out of the way. Run! Maya shouted, fumbling for the bear spray in her pack. Get out of here! The group sprinted up a steep slope that led toward a narrow ridge, their breaths ragged and their limbs aching. Kelly's lungs burned as she fought to keep up, her thoughts consumed by the horrific image of Ethan's shoe among the bones. She glanced back just in time to see the creature prowling at the base of the slope, its hollow gaze fixed on them. Maya reached the ridge first and quickly grabbed a sturdy branch from the ground. She swung it in wide arcs, positioning herself between the creature and the others. Keep moving, she yelled. I'll hold it off. No, Kelly cried, turning to help. We have to stay together. But before she could make it back to Maya, the creature leapt up the slope, its long arms reaching out like grasping roots. Maya swung the branch with all her strength, striking the creature across the head. It recoiled with a screech, but its retaliation was swift and brutal. One clawed arm struck Maya across the chest, sending her sprawling backward. Jared grabbed Kelly's arm, pulling her away from the fight. We can't help her, he shouted, his voice ragged with desperation. If we don't keep moving, we're all dead. Maya struggled to her feet, blood trickling down her face. She looked up at the creature, which loomed over her, its hollow eyes narrowing. "Come on, you ugly bastard," she screamed, raising the branch again. The creature lunged, and with one final, defiant swing, Maya hurled the branch at its head. It shattered on impact, and the creature slammed into her, knocking the air from her lungs. She let out a strangled cry as it dragged her down the slope, her voice fading into the forest. Kelly struggled against Jared's grip, tears streaming down her face. "No, we can't leave her," she screamed, trying to wrench herself free. "We have to go." Jared pulled her along, his own eyes filled with grief. "She bought us time. We have to use it." Ryan stumbled as he ran, glancing back at the slope they had just fled. She's gone," he gasped, his voice hollow with shock. "We just left her." Kelly's knees buckled as she ran, Ethan's sneaker still clutched in her hand. They had lost two of their own, and the creature was still out there, hunting them. The remaining three fled along the ridge, their footsteps pounding against the uneven ground. Jared led the way, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of a way out. "There has to be a road or a river, something we can follow to get out of here," he shouted, his voice edged with desperation. Kelly stumbled over a root, catching herself just in time to avoid a fall. Her thoughts swirled in a haze of grief and exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep moving. There was no time to grieve for Maya, not when they were still being hunted. The path ahead narrowed, hemmed in by thick trees on either side. It felt as though the forest was closing in around them, funneling them towards some unknown fate. Ryan slowed, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "What if it's still following us?" he asked, a note of panic creeping into his voice. "What if we're trapped?" Jared didn't respond. He kept running, his focus on the path ahead, as if sheer determination could will an escape route into existence. But as they pressed on, the air grew colder, the shadows longer, and the sense of being watched became overwhelming. Suddenly, the forest opened up into a narrow gorge, the ground dropping away sharply on either side. Jared skidded to a stop, staring down at the rocky ravine below. "We have to climb down," he said, glancing at Kelly and Ryan. "It's too exposed up here. If we get down there, we might be able to lose it." Kelly nodded, but as she reached the edge, a low growl rumbled from behind them. The creature was back, emerging from the shadows at the far end of the ridge. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if savoring the hunt. Jared grabbed Kelly's arm, his voice shaking. "We don't have time. We need to go now." Ryan hesitated, staring at the drop below. "What if we can't make it?" he asked, his voice small. "We don't have a choice," Kelly said, her voice filled with a steely resolve. She took a deep breath, then began to climb down the rocky slope, her fingers digging into the cracks as she descended. As they scrambled down the gorge, the creature stalked along the ridge above, its hollow eyes watching their every move. It paced back and forth, as if calculating the best moment to strike. The teens struggled down the rocky slope, their fingers digging into the cracks and crevices for any grip they could find. The descent was steep, and each slip of the foot or loose stone sent them sliding a few feet, their hearts leaping into their throats. Kelly's limbs trembled with exhaustion, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She glanced up, her eyes locking onto the creature as it continued to stalk along the ridge. It didn't follow them down. Instead, it seemed content to watch, its gaze unbroken. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to hope that maybe it couldn't reach them down here, that they might have found a temporary reprieve. Jared reached the bottom first, helping Kelly and Ryan down the last few feet. They landed on a bed of loose gravel at the bottom of the gorge, where a narrow stream trickled between the rocks, flowing deeper into the forest. The air down here was colder and damp, and the walls of the gorge towered above them like jagged stone sentinels. Jared took a quick look around, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "We need to keep moving," he said. "Follow the stream. It has to lead somewhere." Ryan's face was ashen, his breaths uneven. What if it's a dead end?" he whispered. "What if we're trapped?" Kelly swallowed hard, forcing herself to stay calm. "It's our only option," she said, trying to inject a note of confidence into her voice. "We can't stay here. If we keep moving, we might find a way out." With no other choice, they followed the stream, moving as quickly as their tired legs could carry them. The gorge walls pressed in close on either side, the rough rock faces streaked with moss and moisture. The path was narrow, forcing them to walk in single file. The shallow stream flowed over jagged stones, its quiet babble the only sound that broke the suffocating silence. They trudged onward, glancing back frequently to check if the creature had followed them down. There was no sign of it, yet the feeling of being watched never left them, as if the forest itself was a living thing, observing their every move. After about 20 minutes, the gorge began to widen, and the stream disappeared underground, leaving behind a bed of moss and thick patches of ferns. The forest loomed ahead, even darker and denser than before. The path they were on seemed to dissolve into the undergrowth, leaving no clear direction to follow. Jared scanned the tree line, his gaze sweeping over the twisted trunks and tangled roots. "We need to find a way up," he said, pointing to a slope that led out of the gorge and into the woods. "If we can get back to higher ground, we might be able to figure out which way to go." They started up the slope, using the trees for support as they climbed. The ground was soft and slippery beneath their feet, making the ascent difficult. Kelly's muscles ached from the constant exertion, but she kept pushing forward, one step at a time. As they neared the top, a sudden, familiar growl reverberated from behind them, echoing through the gorge. Kelly froze, her blood running cold. She turned to see the creature emerging from the darkness below, moving with a slow, deliberate grace. It was closer than ever, its eyes fixed on her as it climbed up the slope, its limbs bending at odd angles, almost spider-like in their reach. "It's coming," Ryan cried, his voice cracking with terror. Jared didn't hesitate. "Move," he shouted, grabbing Kelly's arm and pulling her up the last few feet of the slope. They scrambled over the edge and into the forest, their feet pounding against the earth as they ran deeper into the woods. The darkness closed in around them, the dense canopy above blotting out what little light remained. The creature's growls grew louder, and Kelly could hear the rustle of leaves and the snap of branches as it pursued them. It was gaining ground, closing the distance with every passing second. She could feel the panic rising in her chest, threatening to overwhelm her. As they crashed through the underbrush, Jared suddenly stopped, grabbing Ryan and Kelly by their shoulders. "Wait," he gasped, his voice breathless. "Over there." He pointed to a large, hollowed-out tree trunk a few yards away, its opening just big enough for the three of them to squeeze inside. "It might buy us some time," Jared said urgently. "We can hide." With no other options, they dove toward the tree, crawling inside the hollowed trunk. It was cramped and smelled of damp wood and decay, but it offered cover. They crouched in the darkness, their breaths coming in short, panicked bursts as they listened. Outside, the forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. For a moment, Kelly thought they might have lost the creature. But then, just as quickly, she heard it. A soft, deliberate scraping sound, like claws dragging against the bark of the tree. It was right outside. Kelly held her breath, her heart pounding so loudly that she feared the creature might hear it. The scraping grew louder, and then stopped. The air was thick with tension, and Kelly strained to see through the narrow opening, but the night was pitch black. Suddenly the trunk shook violently, as if something had slammed into it with great force. Ryan let out a muffled cry, and Jared gripped Kelly's arm, his knuckles white. The creature was testing their hiding place, its growls vibrating through the wood. They couldn't stay here. The creature would tear the tree apart if it had to. Kelly's eyes met Jared's in the darkness, and she could see the same thought mirrored in his expression. They had to move, but where? Before they could decide, the tree shook again, harder this time. Splinters of wood rained down around them as the creature's claws scraped and tore at the bark. Jared took a deep breath, then whispered, "When I say go, we run. We head for the clearing over there." He pointed toward a gap in the trees a short distance away. "Now, go," Jared shouted, bursting out of the tree trunk and sprinting toward the clearing. Kelly and Ryan followed, their legs burning with effort as they tore through the undergrowth. The creature roared behind them, its pursuit renewed with a feral intensity. They reached the clearing, a small patch of open ground surrounded by dense thickets and towering pines. Jared spotted a fallen log lying across the ground and vaulted over it, turning to help Kelly and Ryan. The three of them huddled behind the log, trying to catch their breath. The creature was at the edge of the clearing now, stalking forward, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. It didn't lunge immediately. Instead, it circled them, as if savoring the moment, drawing closer with each slow, deliberate step. There was nowhere else to run. Kelly's mind raced for a plan, for anything that could buy them a few precious moments. Jared grabbed a stick from the ground and held it like a spear, his voice low and desperate. "We make our stand here," he said, his eyes never leaving the approaching figure. "Whatever happens, we fight." As the creature closed in, Kelly reached for a nearby rock, her fingers curling around its rough surface. She could see the gleam of the creature's teeth, hear the deep rumble of its growl. There was no escape now, only the will to survive, and the determination not to go down without a fight. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the final confrontation loomed, and Kelly, Jared, and Ryan prepared themselves for what would come next. The creature stalked toward them, its hollow eyes glinting in the dim light. It moved slowly, deliberately, savoring their fear. Jared gripped the stick tightly, his knuckles white. Kelly crouched beside him, clutching a rock, while Ryan trembled a few feet away, his breath ragged and uneven. "Stay together," Jared whispered, his voice tense. "If we scatter, it'll pick us off." The creature suddenly lunged, its limbs stretching forward like jagged branches. Jared swung the stick, striking the creature across the arm with a sharp crack. It recoiled, letting out a guttural snarl that echoed through the clearing. Kelly hurled her rock, the jagged stone striking the creature's chest, but it barely flinched. It shook off the blow, its eyes narrowing with renewed fury. "It's not backing down," Kelly said, her voice quivering. "We can't fight it like this." The creature charged again, moving faster this time, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it closed in. Jared dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the creature's grasp, and Kelly scrambled backward, her heart pounding in her ears. "Run for the trees!" Jared shouted. "Go now!" Kelly and Ryan bolted toward the forest, their legs burning with effort. Jared followed close behind, keeping an eye on the creature as it pursued them with relentless determination. The trees loomed ahead, and the darkness within seemed to swallow them as they plunged into the dense underbrush. The branches snagged at their clothes and scratched their skin, but they kept running, desperate to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the creature. As they ran, Kelly spotted something through the trees. A small, abandoned campsite up ahead, its fire pit filled with charred wood. It was surrounded by old camping gear, long since left behind. She veered toward it, gasping for breath. "Over here, we can use the fire," she cried, skidding to a halt beside the pit. Jared and Ryan followed her, collapsing beside the fire pit. Jared grabbed a nearby branch, still half-burned, and motioned for Kelly to search the scattered belongings. "Find some matches or a lighter," he said, "anything to get a fire going." Kelly rifled through the old camping gear, her hands shaking as she tossed aside rusted cans and damp clothes. Then, she found it, a small metal tin with a handful of matches inside, miraculously dry. Her hands trembled as she struck the first match, holding it to a bundle of dry leaves. The flame flickered, catching on the kindling, and a small fire began to grow. Jared fed the flames, adding twigs and branches as the fire crackled to life. He glanced at Kelly, his expression urgent. "Make it bigger," he said. "We need more light." Ryan scrambled to gather more wood, throwing it onto the growing flames. The fire blazed higher, casting long shadows across the forest and pushing back the encroaching darkness. The creature emerged from the trees, stalking toward the fire, its eyes glowing with malevolence. But as it approached, it hesitated, the light reflecting off its bark-like skin. "It's afraid of the fire," Kelly whispered, a surge of hope rising within her. "We can use it to keep it away." The creature circled them, staying just beyond the reach of the flames. It let out a low, rumbling growl, as if testing their resolve. Jared grabbed a burning branch from the fire, wielding it like a torch. "Back off!" he shouted, waving the branch in front of him. The creature snarled, but retreated slightly, keeping its distance from the flames. The three teens pressed closer to the fire, their backs to the glowing heat as they watched the creature circle. It was clear that the fire was their only defense, but it wouldn't last forever. "We need a plan," Kelly said, her voice barely audible. "We can't stay here. The fire's going to burn out." Jared nodded, glancing at the dark forest beyond. "We need to find a way out while it's still afraid of the flames," he said. "There has to be a road or something nearby. This campsite means people came here before." Ryan's voice trembled as he spoke. "What if it's already too late? What if we're trapped?" They made their move while the fire was still strong, each grabbing a burning branch as they sprinted away from the campsite, using the flames to fend off the creature. The darkness closed in around them as they ran, but the firelight flickered with each step, casting erratic shadows that seemed to twist and writhe in the corners of their vision. Kelly's heart raced as she clutched the burning branch, its heat searing against her palm. She pushed forward, her breaths coming in sharp gasps. The forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, with no sign of a path or road. The fear gnawed at her. What if there really was no way out? A snapping sound behind them made her glance back. The creature was still following, its limbs moving in a grotesque crawl as it pursued them through the forest. It seemed to be biding its time, staying just out of range of the flames, as if waiting for the fire to die down. Jared caught sight of something through the trees, a faint glint of metal. "Over there," he shouted, pointing toward the source of the glint. "I think it's a fence." They stumbled out of the dense underbrush and into a narrow clearing. A rusty chain-link fence stretched out in both directions, overgrown with vines and foliage. It was old, but it represented the first man-made structure they had seen in hours. Jared reached the fence first and grabbed hold of it, shaking it to test its stability. It rattled but held firm. "We have to climb it," Jared said, motioning for Kelly and Ryan to go first. "Hurry!" Kelly gripped the metal links, pulling herself upward, her limbs shaking with the strain. The burning branch fell from her hand as she climbed, and she watched it tumble to the ground, the fire sputtering and finally dying out. Ryan was close behind her, scrambling up the fence with desperation in his eyes. Jared climbed last, casting a quick glance over his shoulder. The creature emerged from the tree line, no longer hesitating now that the fire was gone. It moved quickly, its limbs stretching out as it bounded toward the fence. Kelly threw herself over the top, landing on the other side in a heap. Ryan followed, stumbling to the ground beside her. Jared was almost over when the creature reached the fence, its claws slashing through the gaps in the metal. One clawed hand raked across Jared's leg, and he let out a pained yell as he dropped to the ground on the other side. Jared clutched his leg, his face twisted in pain as he struggled to his feet. "Come on," he grunted, limping as he gestured toward a narrow dirt path on the other side of the fence. "We can't stop now." Kelly and Ryan helped him along, their pace uneven as they hurried down the path. The creature clawed at the fence behind them, growling with frustration. The metal rattled and groaned, but the fence held. For now. The path led them to a gravel road, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. It twisted through the forest, the trees on either side standing tall and ominous. Kelly's heart pounded with a mix of relief and fear. "This has to lead somewhere," she said, glancing at Jared, who was struggling to keep up. "Maybe we can find help." The three of them hobbled down the road, Jared's limp slowing their progress. The forest seemed to watch them from all sides, the darkness deepening as night continued to fall. The gravel crunched beneath their feet, and for a moment there was nothing but the sound of their footsteps and their labored breathing. Then, from somewhere behind them, came a familiar growl. The creature had managed to climb over the fence, and it was coming for them again. Kelly's stomach twisted with dread. "It's still following us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jared gritted his teeth. "Keep going," he urged. "We just have to make it a little farther." The road curved sharply, and as they rounded the bend, they saw it, a small ranger station at the end of the gravel road, its windows dark and its door hanging slightly ajar. It looked abandoned, but it was shelter. It was their only hope. "Inside," Jared yelled, pushing the others toward the station. They burst through the door, slamming it shut behind them, and shoving a nearby desk against it to barricade the entrance. The ranger station was dimly lit by a single emergency light, casting eerie shadows across the room. There were signs of a struggle, broken furniture, scattered papers, and an overturned chair. But there was no one else inside. Kelly rushed to the window, peering out into the darkness. She saw the creature approaching, its silhouette moving steadily up the gravel road toward the station. "It's coming," she said, her voice filled with despair. Jared grabbed an old flare gun from a shelf near the back, loading it with trembling hands. "This is all we've got left," he said, his voice barely audible. "We have to make it count." He gripped the flare gun tightly, his knuckles pale, and turned to face the door. Ryan grabbed a metal fire poker from the corner, positioning himself beside Jared, ready to use it if the creature got through. Kelly found herself backing up toward the window, searching frantically for another way out, but there was none. The station was a single-room structure with no back exit. They were trapped. The growl outside grew louder, vibrating through the walls. The creature reached the door, and the wooden frame creaked as it pushed against the barricade. The desk shuddered under the pressure, its legs scraping against the floor. The pounding at the door intensified, the creature's claws splintering the wood. "Get ready," Jared shouted, raising the flare gun, "as soon as it breaks through." A moment later, the door burst inward with a violent crash. The desk skidded across the floor, and the creature lunged into the room, its hollow eyes gleaming in the dim light. Jared fired the flare gun, the red-hot projectile streaking toward the creature's chest. The flare struck its target, exploding in a blinding burst of light and flame. The creature let out a terrible screech, stumbling back as the flare burned against its bark-like skin. The searing heat made it writhe and thrash, its limbs striking wildly at the air. Ryan seized the opportunity and swung the fire poker, striking the creature's shoulder with a sickening crunch. The blow barely staggered it, but the combined assault seemed to slow it down, at least for a moment. "Out the window!" Jared yelled, already moving to help Kelly shove open the nearest one. The old frame resisted at first, but together they managed to force it open wide enough to climb through. Ryan scrambled out first, followed by Kelly, who glanced back just in time to see the creature recovering. Jared clambered through the window last, and as he landed outside, he stumbled and fell, clutching his injured leg. Kelly pulled him to his feet, her gaze fixed on the ranger station's doorway, where the creature was emerging, its body still smoldering from the flare. "Run!" she screamed, helping Jared limp away from the building. The three of them dashed back toward the gravel road, the station receding behind them. They could hear the creature's labored breathing, its snarls filled with rage as it pursued them once more. As they ran, Kelly spotted a small hill just off the road, topped with large boulders and rocky outcroppings. "Up there," she yelled, pointing to the hill. "We can use the rocks to fight it off." They made a desperate climb up the slope, Jared gritting his teeth against the pain in his leg. The rocky terrain offered some natural protection, and they took cover behind a cluster of boulders. The creature appeared at the base of the hill, its eyes blazing with fury. It started to climb, its limbs bending and stretching to pull itself upward. Jared handed the empty flare gun to Kelly, his face set with grim determination. "We need to use whatever we have left," he said, grabbing a fist-sized rock and hefting it in his hand. "We can't let it get any closer." Ryan joined in, grabbing loose stones and hurling them down at the creature as it ascended. The rocks struck its body with dull thuds, but it kept coming, relentless and undeterred. It reached the halfway point, its hollow gaze locking onto them with an intensity that made Kelly's skin crawl. Kelly gripped the flare gun tightly, frustration surging within her as she realized it was now useless. She glanced around, her mind racing for a solution, when her eyes fell on a large, loose boulder perched near the edge of the hill. If they could dislodge it, it might be enough to slow the creature down or even crush it. "Help me with this," she shouted to Jared and Ryan, rushing over to the boulder. The three of them leaned into it, pushing with every ounce of strength they had left. The boulder shifted slightly, but it was heavier than they'd expected. "It's coming!" Ryan cried, his voice filled with panic as the creature drew closer, reaching the top of the hill. With a final, desperate heave, they managed to tip the boulder over the edge. It rolled down the slope with gathering speed, crashing directly into the creature's path. The impact knocked the creature off balance, sending it tumbling backward down the hill, where it hit the ground with a resounding thud. For a moment, there was silence, save for the ragged breathing of the three teens. Kelly peered down the slope, her chest heaving, watching as the creature lay sprawled at the base, its limbs twisted and motionless. Her heart hammered in her chest, hope flickering within her that it might finally be over. But then the creature stirred, its limbs twitching as it slowly began to rise. It pushed itself up, its movements sluggish but determined, and lifted its head to glare at them with renewed rage. The boulder had hurt it, but it hadn't been enough to stop it. "It's still alive," Kelly whispered, the words barely leaving her lips. Jared grabbed her arm, his expression filled with a desperate resolve. "We need to finish this," he said, his voice low and fierce. "We can't keep running." As the creature struggled to regain its footing, Kelly, Jared, and Ryan stared down at it, paralyzed by the realization that nothing they did seemed to truly harm it. The boulder had barely slowed it, and now, as the creature began to climb the hill once more, it became clear that no amount of fire or force could end this nightmare. "We can't kill it," Kelly whispered, fear threading through her voice. "Nothing we do is working." Jared's eyes darted around frantically, searching for a way out. "We need to get to the road," he said. "It's our only chance." Without hesitation, they turned and sprinted down the hill, away from the struggling creature. The slope was steep, and they stumbled over loose rocks and tree roots, barely keeping their balance as they raced toward the narrow dirt road they had seen earlier. Behind them, the creature's growls grew louder, filled with a renewed rage. It wasn't giving up the hunt. The three teens burst out of the woods onto the gravel road, their breaths ragged and their bodies aching. For a moment, they thought about hiding in the trees again, but then they saw it. A pair of headlights in the distance, the faint hum of an approaching vehicle. It was a park ranger's truck, coming down the road toward them. "Over here," Jared shouted, waving his arms desperately as the truck drew closer. The driver hit the brakes, and the truck skidded to a stop a few yards away. The ranger jumped out, his face a mask of shock and concern as he took in the sight of the filthy, terrified teenagers. "What happened to you kids?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Are you hurt?" Kelly opened her mouth to speak, but she didn't know how to begin. The truth was too unbelievable, too nightmarish to explain. Instead, Jared stepped forward, his voice shaking. We were attacked," he said. "In the forest, there's something out there." The ranger's eyes narrowed with confusion. "What do you mean, something?" Jared's throat tightened as he glanced at Kelly and Ryan. "Ethan and Maya, they didn't make it," he said, his voice barely audible. "We tried to save them, but—" The ranger's expression turned grim. "Get in the truck," he said, gesturing for them to climb inside. "I'll call this in. We'll get you to safety." As they climbed into the truck, Kelly cast one last glance back at the dark line of trees. The creature was nowhere to be seen, but she could still feel its presence, lingering just beyond the reach of the headlights. She shuddered and turned away, praying that they had finally escaped. The days following their rescue were a blur of police questioning, hospital visits, and restless nights. Jared, Kelly, and Ryan were treated for their injuries, but the authorities had many questions, and the answers they gave only made things worse. Their story of a monstrous creature in the woods was met with skepticism, and as the police searched the forest, they found no signs of the creature, only the remains of a park ranger, and Maya and Ethan, their bodies marked with gashes and a vandalized ranger station. The investigators found no evidence of an animal attack, leading them to suspect foul play. With no proof of the creature's existence, the teens quickly became the prime suspects in the deaths of their friends. The authorities believed that there had been a terrible accident or even a deliberate act of violence that the three survivors were trying to cover up. For months, the investigation continued, the police grilling them repeatedly, but there was no solid evidence to charge them with murder. Only the whispers of doubt and suspicion that followed them everywhere. As the case went cold, the town's gossip turned vicious, with people speculating about what might have really happened out there. Some claimed it was a drug-fueled accident. Others whispered darkly about a teenage dare gone wrong, playing on TV at the local bar. News anchor. Good evening, I'm Carla Daniels, and tonight's top story continues to be the chilling case that has captivated our community. Nearly 2 months after a harrowing incident left 2 local teenagers dead on the local trails, questions remain about what really happened on that fateful night. 18-year-olds Ethan Sullivan and Maya Green were found dead in the woods, their bodies bearing slashes and injuries looking like they were in a struggle. Their surviving friends, Jared Thompson, Kelly Rowe, and Ryan Dawson, claim they were attacked by a creature they described as inhuman. However, investigators have been unable to find any evidence to support these claims. Police Detective. Hello, I'm Detective Warren. We've conducted an exhaustive search of the forest and haven't found any signs of the so-called creature the teens described. The injuries on the victims don't match any known animal attacks in the area, and there's nothing to indicate the presence of a dangerous predator. News anchor. As a result, suspicion has fallen on the 3 survivors, with some authorities suggesting that there may have been foul play involved. Though police have not officially charged Jared, Kelly, or Ryan, sources tell us that investigators are treating them as persons of interest. The survivors, who were all close friends with the deceased, have repeatedly denied any wrongdoing, insisting that they did everything they could to save Ethan and Maya. But with a lack of physical evidence to support their claims and no other credible suspects, the court of public opinion is growing increasingly divided. I mean, come on. A creature in the woods? It sounds like they're just trying to cover something up. It's a real tragedy, but we need answers. News anchor. The investigation remains open, but with no new leads and mounting public pressure, the fate of the 3 young suspects hangs in the balance. We'll continue to bring you updates as more information becomes available. Until next week. This has been Carla Daniels. Kelly, Jared, and Ryan couldn't escape the rumors. Even after counseling sessions meant to help them cope with their trauma, the questions and accusations lingered. Their friendships grew strained under the weight of it all, the shared burden of a horror that no one believed. It had been nearly 5 years since that night in the forest. Jared, Kelly, and Ryan had done their best to move on, but the events of that night still haunted them. The years had not been kind. Jared had developed a restless obsession with proving the truth. Kelly struggled with anxiety and guilt, and Ryan had withdrawn into himself, rarely speaking of what had happened. But now, with the anniversary approaching, Jared had convinced them to return to the forest. He was certain that if they could just find some proof, some evidence of the creature's existence, they could finally put the rumors to rest and prove their story. Despite their lingering fears, Kelly and Ryan agreed, if for no other reason than to gain some closure. The 3 of them stood at the edge of the forest once more, the trees rising like dark sentinels before them. The forest was just as menacing as they remembered, its canopy thick and tangled, its shadows deep and full of secrets. The familiar sense of being watched settled over them, but they pushed forward, retracing the steps they had taken that fateful night. Hours passed as they searched the area where the attacks had occurred, their flashlights sweeping over the forest floor and across the tree trunks. They found nothing, no signs of the struggle, no traces of the creature. It was as if the forest had swallowed all evidence of what had happened, leaving only empty woods behind. Just as despair began to set in, a soft sound drifted through the trees, a voice, faint and distant. Help, me. Kelly's blood ran cold. It was Ethan's voice, calling out to them, just as it had on that terrible night. Her hands tightened around the flashlight as she turned toward the sound, her heart pounding. Did you hear that? She whispered, her voice shaking. It's here. The voice echoed again, closer this time, and then another joined it, Maya's voice, pleading for help. Please don't leave me. Ryan took a step back, his face pale, his voice barely audible. It's happening again. The voices continued, overlapping and distorted, calling out from every direction. Kelly, Jared, help us. The forest seemed to come alive with the sound, as if mocking them with the memories of their lost friends. Jared's flashlight beam swept over the trees, his breathing quick and shallow. We need to go, he said, his voice rising in panic. We need to get out of here now. As the 3 of them turned to leave, a low growl rumbled from the darkness, followed by the sound of movement just beyond the reach of their lights. The whispers grew louder, merging into a nightmarish chorus that filled the forest with a terrible familiarity. Kelly's heart raced as she glanced back one last time. There, in the shadows, she could swear she saw it. A shape, tall and gaunt, with eyes that glinted faintly in the darkness. The creature was still there, lurking in the depths of the forest, using the voices of their friends to draw them back in. As they fled the forest, Kelly couldn't shake the feeling that the nightmare was far from over. The creature hadn't forgotten them, and now it was calling them home. A TV at a local bar later that week. News anchor Carla Daniels. Breaking news tonight. 3 hikers have gone missing while hiking on the local trails. Authorities say that the hikers, all in their early 20s, were last seen entering the trailhead earlier this week. The families of the missing individuals reported them overdue late last night after they failed to return from a planned day hike. Local officials have launched an extensive search effort, but so far, there has been no sign of the missing hikers. Search volunteer. We're covering as much ground as we can, but the forest is vast and conditions are difficult. We haven't found any clues yet. No footprints, no gear, nothing. News anchor. We'll continue to monitor this developing story and bring you updates as we learn more. Stay tuned.